Imagine an entire army standing on one side of a valley, fully equipped for battle, yet completely unable to move. They have weapons, they have soldiers, they have experience, but every morning a single man walks out in front of them, speaks a few words, and sends the entire army back into hiding. For 40 days Goliath does this. He stands before the armies of Israel and challenges them to send someone to fight him. His size is terrifying, his armor is impressive, and his reputation as a warrior is enough to make trained soldiers afraid. But the most powerful weapon Goliath possesses is not the sword in his hand. It is the fear he creates in the minds of everyone watching him. And then David arrives. David is not a soldier. He is a young shepherd who has been sent to the battlefield to bring food to his brothers. He is not looking for a fight. He is not searching for an opportunity to become famous. But when he hears Goliath mocking the armies of Israel and defying the living God, David cannot understand why everyone is running away. The soldiers see a giant who is too powerful to defeat. David sees a man who has dared to challenge God. That difference in perspective is the hidden message behind the story of David and Goliath. Because this story is often reduced to a simple motivational lesson. The small person defeats the big person, so never give up. But the story is much deeper than that. David and Goliath is not primarily about believing in yourself. It is about what happens when fear becomes larger in your mind than God. The soldiers of Israel were not necessarily cowards. They were trained warriors. They knew how to fight. They understood the danger of the battlefield. But Goliath had managed to convince them that the situation was impossible. Every morning, they heard his voice. Every evening, they heard his voice again. And after hearing the same threat for 40 days, fear had become their reality. This is something that happens in our own lives more often than we realize. We may not be standing in a valley facing a literal giant, but we can still find ourselves listening to the same voice every day, the voice telling us that we will never change, the voice telling us that our past has already determined our future, the voice telling us that our problems are too big and that there is no point trying anymore. The longer we listen to fear, the more powerful it begins to feel. Goliath did not have to defeat the entire army physically. He had already defeated them mentally. And then David walks into the situation with a completely different question. Instead of asking, "How big is this man?" David asks, "Who is this man that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David is not denying Goliath's size. He is not pretending that the giant is harmless. He is not pretending that the danger is imaginary. He simply refuses to believe that the giant is the greatest reality in the situation. And this is one of the most important lessons in the entire story. Faith does not mean pretending that your problems do not exist. Faith does not mean looking at a serious situation and saying, "There is nothing wrong." The problem may be real. The danger may be real. The uncertainty may be real. But faith reminds you that the problem is not the only reality that exists. The army looked at Goliath and saw an impossible enemy. David looked at Goliath and remembered the God who had already been faithful to him. That is why David's courage did not begin on the battlefield. It began years earlier, in the fields where nobody was watching. Before David ever faced Goliath, he had already spent years taking care of sheep. To everyone else, this may have looked like an insignificant life. He was not leading an army. He was not sitting in a palace. He was not receiving public recognition. He was simply doing the work that had been placed in front of him. But while David was in the wilderness, God was preparing him. David had already faced danger. He had fought against a lion and a bear to protect his father's sheep. Those experiences were not identical to facing Goliath, but they taught David something important. He had already seen God help him before. So when David stood before Goliath, he was not suddenly trying to manufacture faith from nothing. He was remembering. He remembered the battles nobody else had seen. He remembered the moments when he had been vulnerable. He remembered the faithfulness of God. And this is why the private seasons of life can matter more than we realize. There are seasons when nobody notices you. Seasons when you are working, learning, struggling, and trying to remain faithful without receiving any applause. You may wonder whether anything important is happening, but David's time in the field was not wasted. The wilderness was preparing him for the valley. The private battles were preparing him for the public one. And sometimes the season you are currently trying to escape is developing something you will need later. David did not become courageous when Goliath appeared. Goliath simply revealed the courage that had already been developed in David. This is why you should not despise the small battles in your life. The difficult situation you are facing today may be teaching you how to trust God in a situation you are not yet ready to face. Now, when David decides that he will fight Goliath, King Saul tries to give him his armor. From a human perspective, this makes perfect sense. David is going into battle against a heavily armed warrior, so Saul gives him the equipment of a soldier, but David cannot use it. The armor does not fit him, so David removes it and goes to the battle with the weapon he actually knows how to use, a sling. This moment is easy to overlook, but it contains a powerful lesson. David could not defeat Goliath by pretending to be Saul. He could not fight effectively while wearing someone else's armor. He had to go into the battle as the person God had prepared him to be. And many people make the same mistake today. They spend their lives looking at other people and believing they need someone else's life, personality, resources, or opportunities before they can do what God has called them to do. They see somebody else's success and think, I need their armor. They see somebody else's talent and think, I need their weapon. They see somebody else's journey and assume that their own journey is not enough. But God did not ask David to become Saul. David did not need Saul's armor. He needed to trust God with what he already had. The sling did not look impressive compared to Goliath's sword and armor, but it was familiar to David. He knew how to use it, and sometimes what God has placed in your hands may appear small compared to what someone else possesses. But the question is not always how impressive the tool looks. The question is whether you are willing to trust God with what you have. David did not have the strongest weapon. He had the weapon he knew how to use, and God was able to use it. When David finally approaches Goliath, the giant looks at him and is insulted. Goliath sees a young shepherd. He sees someone who appears insignificant. He cannot understand why Israel would send someone so unimpressive to fight him. But Goliath is judging David based on what he can see. And that is another important message in the story. People can only judge the version of you that is visible to them. They may see your current circumstances, but they do not see everything God is developing within you. They may see your mistakes, but they do not see the future God can still bring out of your life. They may see your weakness, but they do not see what God can do through someone who is willing to trust him. Goliath saw a shepherd boy. He did not see the future king. And sometimes the person God is preparing in private does not look impressive to the world yet. This is why you cannot always measure your potential by your current appearance. You may feel unqualified. You may feel behind. You may feel too inexperienced. You may feel as if nobody notices you. But the Bible repeatedly shows that God is not limited by what people expect. The world often looks at size, reputation, experience, and appearance. God looks at the heart. The army saw Goliath's size. David saw God's greatness. And the battle was ultimately decided by that difference. David did not say, I am stronger than Goliath. He did not say, I have better weapons. He did not say, I am more experienced. David's confidence was not in himself. It was in God. This is the difference between confidence in yourself and confidence in God. Confidence in yourself says, I am strong enough. Faith says, I may not be strong enough, but God is. Confidence in yourself says, I know exactly what to do. Faith says, I may not know everything, but I know who I am trusting. Confidence in yourself says, I can control the outcome. Faith says, I will do what I am called to do and trust God with what I cannot control. And that is why the story should not be misunderstood as a promise that every problem will disappear instantly if you simply believe hard enough. David and Goliath is not teaching that every believer will always receive the exact outcome they want. The Bible does not promise that every battle will be easy. Some faithful people experience dramatic victories. Others experience long seasons of suffering. Some prayers are answered through miracles. Others are answered with the strength to endure. So the lesson is not that faith gives us control over every outcome. The lesson is that we should never measure God's power by the size of the problem standing in front of us. Goliath was real, but he was not God. The danger was real, but it was not greater than God. The future was uncertain, but it was not outside God's knowledge. And David understood something that the entire army had forgotten. The size of the enemy does not determine the greatness of God. When David releases the stone, Goliath falls. And suddenly, the army that had been hiding begins to move. The same soldiers who had been afraid now pursue the Philistines. Why? Because fear is contagious. But courage is contagious too. For 40 days, the army listened to Goliath's voice. Then one person stood up, and suddenly, everyone else remembered that they were not as powerless as they had believed. This is why your faithfulness may matter more than you realize. You may think you are only trying to survive your own battle, but somebody else may be watching you. Somebody else may find courage because you refuse to give up. Somebody else may begin trusting God because they saw you remain faithful during a difficult season. You may never know who is being strengthened by your example. David did not walk into the valley knowing that an entire army would be encouraged by what he did. He simply decided that fear would not determine what he believed about God. And perhaps that is the central message of this entire story. The giant was not the only thing standing in front of Israel. Fear was standing in front of them too. And sometimes the biggest battle in our lives is not only the problem itself, it is what the problem has convinced us to believe. A failure may convince you that your future is over. A rejection may convince you that you are worthless. A difficult season may convince you that God has abandoned you. A financial problem may convince you that you will never recover. But fear is not always a reliable interpreter of reality. When you are afraid, everything looks bigger. The danger feels closer. The future feels darker. Your options appear smaller. And God can begin to feel distant. This is why the question is not only, how big is the giant? The deeper question is, what has the giant caused me to forget? Have you forgotten what God has already brought you through? Have you forgotten His faithfulness? Have you forgotten that your identity is not determined by one failure? Have you forgotten that your current season is not the entire story of your life? Have you forgotten that God can use what looks small? Have you forgotten that you do not need someone else's armor? David remembered. He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear. He remembered the faithfulness of God. And when Goliath appeared, David's memory became stronger than his fear. Perhaps that is why remembering is so important for believers. Every day we are surrounded by voices telling us what to fear. Our past reminds us of our failures. The world constantly shows us what we lack. Anxiety tells us what could go wrong. And in the middle of all those voices, we need to remember what is true. God is still faithful. God is still present. God is still powerful. Your past is not greater than His grace. Your weakness is not greater than His strength. Your problem is not greater than His ability. And your giant is not greater than your God. The hidden message behind David and Goliath is not simply that a small person can defeat a big person. It is that the size of the enemy does not determine the outcome when God is involved. The world says, look at the giant. Faith says, look at God. The world says, look at what you lack. Faith says, look at what God can do with what you have. The world says you are too small. Faith says God has used small things before. The world says you are not qualified. Faith says God does not need you to be someone else. And perhaps today you are standing in your own Valley of Elah. Maybe there is something you have been listening to for a long time, a voice telling you that you cannot change, a voice telling you that your future is hopeless, a voice telling you that your failure defines you, a voice telling you that you are too far behind. Maybe the first step is not defeating the giant. Maybe the first step is refusing to allow the giant to define your reality. You may still be afraid. You may still feel weak. You may not know exactly how the battle will end, but you can choose which voice you will believe. Goliath had a voice, but God had already spoken, and God's voice was greater. David did not know every detail of the future. He did not know exactly how the battle would unfold. He simply knew that Goliath was not greater than God. Sometimes that is all the faith you need for the next step. Not complete certainty. Not a guarantee that everything will work out perfectly. Just enough trust to move forward. Because faith is not always about knowing exactly what will happen next. Sometimes faith is simply remembering who God is while you are still standing in the middle of uncertainty. So whatever you are facing today, do not pretend that the giant is small. You do not have to deny that the problem is serious. You do not have to pretend that you are not afraid. But remember this, the problem is not the highest power in your life. God is. And the same God who was with David in the wilderness is the God who can be with you in your battle. The same God who used a shepherd boy can use what seems insignificant in your life. The same God who gave David courage can give you strength for the next step. The giant may be large, but it is not God. The problem may be serious, but it is not God. The future may be uncertain, but it is not outside God's knowledge. Your weakness may be real, but it is not greater than God's strength. And your fear may be loud, but it does not have to be the voice that leads you. David walked toward Goliath because he had already decided that the giant would not determine what he believed about God. And perhaps that is the hidden message behind the story. The greatest battle is often not only between you and the thing you fear. It is between fear and faith inside you. The army looked at Goliath and ran away. David looked at Goliath and moved forward. The giant was the same. The God was the same. The difference was what they believed. So when you face your own giant, remember the lesson David carried into the valley. You do not have to be the strongest person in the situation. You do not need someone else's armor. You do not need to pretend that the problem is small. You simply need to remember that what is standing in front of you is not greater than the God who stands with you. And sometimes, faith begins with one simple decision. You hear the voice of fear. You see the size of the obstacle. You recognize your own weakness. And then you remember, God has been faithful before. God is faithful now. And God will still be God when this battle is over. If this video brought clarity and strength to your spirit, drop a like to help us share this message across the platform, subscribe for more deep dive spiritual content, and send this to someone who needs an anchor today. Keep your eyes fixed on the Master, stay rooted in the Word, and build your house firmly on the rock. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next video.